Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hello there. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour Podcast with Federal Newswire. I am your host, Andrew Langer. So glad you could join us today. Joining me today is someone I've been wanting to talk to for quite some time. His name is Charlie Sauer. He is the head of the Market Institute. We're going to get all into what that is. We're going to be talking about patent issues and intellectual property, and also about Charlie's background. He's got a new podcast. We're going to be talking a little bit about that. And actually, let us start here. What is the Market Institute?
Well, the Market Institute is a 501c4 nonprofit. And what that allows us to do is educate, but also carry a baseball bat on our shoulder.
Nice.
So,
I'm familiar with that.
When we need to be aggressive, we can be aggressive. And realistically, what our strong point is, the thing that we're good at, is taking nerd speak and taking academic writing and making it so that it's actually messageable, and taking it onto Capitol Hill so that the staffers understand what's being said in these academic papers.
And how did you come to this? I mean, so your background, you went to college in the Midwest. Talk a little bit about that journey. I mean, were you always fascinated by public policy, or what was that all about?
Well, I think it kind of started with my dad, actually. Yeah. I'm gonna take it all the way back there, and then we'll move pretty quick.
Listen, it's the same thing with me, so yeah.
He was a lawyer and used to take me to court with him, and so I got to hear him argue cases in court. And so from there, I started kind of loving the language and the art of argument and the art of debate. And when I went to college, numbers were my thing. So I ended up in economics and going to William Jewell College, which is a small liberal arts college in the Midwest. I was really the only real economics major. So it was interesting. It was me and my professor, who was a Chicago grad.
Wow.
For like 2 years, just kind of one-on-one talking.
That's
kind
amazing.
Of deep
economics. Let's ping on that for a second, because that's kind of amazing. You think about this and the ability. There's almost like an old school, 18th century, tutorial with great masters of it. You're sort of sitting with someone who, as you said, is a Chicago grad and able to have those conversations. That's fantastic.
No, it's one of the types of experiences that taught me how to think.
Sure.
In a lot of ways, because it's a small liberal arts college, we didn't have some of the computer programs and software that others had. But as you know, the further you get along, it's how you think, not necessarily how many computer programs you know. And so going back on it, the William Jewell was a writing school. And writing has helped me out through my career. But honestly, it's the how to think about economics and how to think like an economist.
It's interesting, because I'm sort of parallel with that, because I learned a lot about regulation and choices and regulatory decision making from my dad. Went to work for a blind lawyer as his reader and was reading the law for 8 to 10 hours and having that same kind of an education. So you come to D.C. What did you come directly from William Jewell College? How did that journey happen?
Yeah, so my aunt gave me a gas card, and so I had a gas card that paid for my gas to get across the country, and I moved in with her. She worked in the government at the time, and started handing out resumes on Capitol Hill. And as you know, because we've been around these stories for a while, I got my first internship because I could play softball.
That's interesting.
And so I was the ringer on the softball team as a former baseball player in college.
Is that right? I see. This is why we do this, because I had no idea.
So it was fun, though. So that was with...
What position did you play in high school?
I was a catcher in high school and a catcher in college.
Well, listen, to me, the most important position on the team.
Well, you wear the tools of ignorance, but you also get to be involved with the plays. You get to be involved with the kind of psychology of the pitcher and the psychology of the batter, which is its own form of debate. And so it was fun to do that. But that was working with Senator Kit Bond of Missouri.
Makes sense.
Who is one of those people, when you look at the Senate, is a true senator.
Yeah.
His name didn't stand out as a real national guy, but when you know the Senate and you paid attention, his office and his staff and him personally, he's one of the people that was able to get things done and push things through. And so it was a great learning experience. And then from there, I moved over to Chuck Grassley's office, Senator Grassley from Iowa. And then I got kind of another good senator, a great senator who has gotten a lot of stuff done, but I got to see what it was like to be kind of the chair of a committee and the differences that took. And from there, I moved off Capitol Hill and moved to Governor Jeb Bush.
Okay.
Jeb ! Bush.
Sure.
And
was this
so?
This was after the what was that? The 90? What year was it?
No, this was in 2000 and
this was after.
This was I worked for Jeb in his last year as governor, somewhere around 2004, 2005.
Down in Tallahassee.
I was actually in D.C. I was at the Hall of States.
Sure. That makes sense.
So, and I was in charge of his labor policy at the time in the D.C. office. But because he was Jeb and I'm more of a libertarian economist. I could do his immigration policy without really talking to him, and I could do the tax policy without talking to him. So I got to touch on those as well.
And then when was the Market Institute founded?
So the Market Institute was founded in, I think it was 2009.
Okay.
It was after I worked for a think tank for a little while, and I just looked around and saw that there was nobody that was really working for the small businesses on Capitol Hill. Now, there's small business organizations all around.
I've worked for one,
They tend to focus more on campaigns, or they have large corporate donors, and so they have the small businesses as members, but they really focus on large corporate policy, which is fine. That's an organization. But I wanted to go represent Main Street on Capitol Hill.
Sure.
And it turns out that as a starting business owner, a lot of small businesses didn't really know what to do with me. And so I ended up working with associations, which they're the groups that put out a lot of the nerdy writing that Capitol Hill staff, 28 years old, hasn't been married, doesn't have a house, but they're educated and driven and knowledgeable. That was the type of work that they needed. They needed somebody to come and explain what this doctors association needed.
Sure. That's interesting stuff. So let's shift our attention sort of the meat of the conversation, which is, intellectual property, the patent system. So the patent system has changed over the last decade and a half. Talk about that.
So I'm going to take this one back to my mom because I want to start there. My parents were divorced, and so I had a single mom. Being a single mom is hard, and so one point she was stressed. I think we were coming on to the holiday season, and she's like, you know what? Somebody invented a pet rock, and they made it rich off of a pet rock. I can come up with something that's better than a pet rock. And so she created the All Ball. It was a baseball football. It was about the size of a baseball. It had red stitching like a baseball, but it was shaped like a football with beanbag material inside of it. And to get that done, she had the idea. She filed the patent. She filed the trademark. She flew to China to get the manufacturing set. And she was able to get that product onto the store shelves of Walmart, which was amazing for a single mom to just believe she could do it and get it done. Now, we didn't get rich off of the All Ball, but I was able to see what was possible when you have an idea.
That's amazing. That really is amazing.
US. So we fast forward to Capitol Hill, and I grew up as around these entrepreneurs.
Sure.
And when I started the Market Institute, one of my friends called me up and they said, you're not going to believe what kind of bill they're working on Capitol Hill. They're working on a bill that's going to change us from first to invent to first to file. Wow. Now, what that means is first to invent means that a garage inventor can have an idea and put it in their notebook and have basic ownership of that idea until they get it ready to go to the patent office.
Of course, yeah.
Now, first to file means that the company with the most lawyers on staff that can file the most patents is going to be in the lead. So now it's not first to invent where you can invent the next best mousetrap. It's the first to have this idea and rush down to the patent office with 20 grand.
Pull it back, right? Your mom invents All Ball. She goes to China. Somebody over in China gets, or actually, I guess she would have filed before she went to China, right?
Yeah, you filed.
But somebody would have gotten wind of it beforehand, and they got an army of lawyers. And all of a sudden, they patented it. I think there was oh good Lord, there was the balloon thing.
Yeah,
a bunch of balloons thing. That was a whole thing. It's interesting because I was literally just thinking about this today. When we're recording this, for those of you who don't know, as we're recording this, DC's in a big rainstorm. It's just an awful weather day outside, and all I could think about, because I was carrying a bunch of stuff into the studio, my daughter had a great idea for an invention, which was essentially a way for kids No, I'll give it away because we're not doing anything with it. You want to do something with your welcome of attaching an attachment for an umbrella, to a backpack strap, so you can put the umbrella in the backpack and still have your hands free to do stuff. And it was to me a brilliant idea. It's like I'm thinking about, I could use that today. As I'm carrying stuff and I got stuff in both hands. Wouldn't it be great to have that?
No,
thing?
I left stuff in the car because of that.
But this is what you're saying, right? Is that now someone would hear that idea and because they would file first, they would get the patent on it. That seems patently unfair, to use a pun.
Well, and another way to put it, and because that's true, but another way to think about this too is that your daughter has that invention.
Yeah.
To get a patent that is defensible is going to be somewhere around 20 grand to actually file the patent and have the lawyer do the correct research and write up the patent in a way that you can defend it.
Yeah.
A bunch of balloons actually did that.
Yes.
That's Josh Malone, and he's great. Now, if you are Apple and you have a bunch of lawyers on staff, the longer they sit there without filing a patent, the more expensive each patent that they file becomes. So the more, if a lawyer files one patent a year, that patent costs you, let's call it $200,000.
Wow.
But if that same lawyer files 20 patents a year, right?
Yeah.
Each patent only costs you $10,000.
Okay.
So
interesting.
That's just, they're sitting at a desk. The more work they do, the less expensive they are as an employee. And so it reduces the cost for the big guys.
Oh, yes, I see what you're saying.
While the little guys still have the same cost.
This is the issue of economies of scale, the difference between small business regulatory impacts and big business regulatory impacts.
And so it's amazing. Not only what you said is true, but it has this magnification effect and this multiplier effect that is the problem. So that's how I got started in the patent system. Was talking about these issues, but the bill that was in hit inventors at every single section of the bill, and it made it harder. They created a kangaroo court for inventors. They tried to make it so that medium-sized businesses weren't going to be able to file. They started to make it so that if an invention infringed, only the piece of the product that infringed was liable, which is its own problem. Like if there's infringing products in this computer, you could only sue the chip manufacturer, not the actual manufacturer of the computer who's using stolen goods.
That's astounding to me.
Now, the reason this happens, and this makes complete sense to me, is that, businesses see technology as a cost.
Yes.
And so they want to figure out how to reduce their cost of doing business. And so instead of working harder and making more technology themselves, they just go up to Capitol Hill and they make patents less effective, less defensible. And so that's what I've been dealing with on Capitol Hill for the last decade, but we've been dealing with it as a country for really the past 50, 60 years.
I mean, it's one of those things. And actually that gets us into the issue of China, because our relationship with China has changed so much in the last half century.
Yeah.
So when we weaken our patent protections here at home, and we know, and I'm going to just say it, out there, that we know that China really makes its economy off of stealing ideas from other people and producing them using slave labor. That creates huge problems. Talk about that significance.
So what's interesting, when China went through their Cultural Revolution in the late 70s, one of the first things that they did was actually give people the ability to file patents. They gave one of the first rights that they handed back to people was this right to their own intellectual property.
Isn't that interesting?
Which is also the same right that our founders gave us. The only actual right in the Constitution, or in the original Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, is the right to a patent.
Yeah.
And so our founders knew the importance of this.
Time out. Before we go down the road to China, let's ping on this for a second, because the issue, why is it important to have that right to exclusivity? Talk about that in terms of there, and we could talk about it in terms of pharmaceuticals, but talk about that.
So I recently did a video where I put two buckets in front of people.
Okay.
And the first set of buckets was a $5 bucket right in front of them and a $5 bucket 10 feet out.
Yeah.
And I handed them a ping pong ball and I said, whichever bucket you want to throw it into, if you make it, I'll give you the money.
Yeah.
So, there's always a 10th dentist. So there was one guy that went for the 10-foot one, but every single person put it in the $5 bucket right at their feet.
Yes.
So then I changed up the scenario and I put a $5 bucket at their feet and a $10 bucket 10 feet out.
Interesting.
And I handed them the ping pong ball, and then 60-70% of the people
Got
shot
it.
for the $10 bucket. And the point is that incentives matter.
Yes.
So without that ability to have intellectual property, without that ability to have something
That's
that
a
you can
brilliant
defend,
idea,
then you don't have the incentive to invest in it.
Sure.
Because look, even Bunch of Balloons, that's Josh Malone. I don't know how many kids he has, but let's call it's a bunch.
Yes. I've met him. I gave him a tour of William and Mary a few years back. Yeah.
So he has a bunch of kids. He had to spend a lot of money to get that invention to market.
Sure.
The only reason that he's going to spend that money to get it to market is because he had a patent that was defensible.
Right.
And in fact, the patent system has eroded so much, even though his patent was defensible, he was almost not able to defend it. And the only way he was able to defend it is it was the #1 selling toy, or he wouldn't have had enough money to defend it.
It's interesting because this is what Hernando de Soto talks about in The Mystery of Capital, which is this idea of, when you have the ownership of the property, you can use that to sort of invest. It creates all kinds of issues in terms of political stability and economic prosperity. There's certainty there. It's part of the reason why I bucked the trend with a lot of my conservative colleagues and supported the law of the sea treaty, because we were essentially trying to find a way to assign property rights in terms of, fisheries offshore or not fisheries in terms of the law of the sea treaty. That's catch shares. But in terms of the law of the sea treaty, the idea of you have something that is defensible in terms of your investment in trying to extract resources from the bottom of the ocean.
Yep.
But all of these, they all have that thread about self-investment. It's private property rights. So go ahead. I'm sorry. So let's talk about China.
So it's China saw this, and while they've been expanding their intellectual property base, in the U.S., we've been shrinking ours. So where do we see our entrepreneurs and investors moving? They're moving to China. So while before you were exactly correct, China's economy was largely based on mimicking everything in the U.S., now they're starting to beat us and move ahead. And the problem here is that there's a long tail before you even see the beginning of what intellectual property or innovation brings. Because, you have an idea for, let's say, 5G today. That's several years away from deployment, and the beginning deployment doesn't matter. So when China steps ahead of us, it means that they're going to be ahead, not just for a year, they're going to be ahead for decades. And that's where not only do we need to fight China's taking of U.S. intellectual property, but we need to have, I'm a believer in offense instead of defense, 100%. Right? The offense is not weakening our patent rights. It's making them stronger so that there's a bigger incentive. Look, if I would have I had 60-70% of the people took the risk. If I would have put 10 grand out there,
sure, of course,
everybody would have taken the
that
risk.
makes, absolutely, 100%.
That's what we need to do for U.S. innovation.
How come you didn't bring the buckets to the studio today? I should have had you do that. We could have done something on the table. It would have been a lot of fun. So let's flip it around, right?
Yeah.
Because this is, to me, self-evident. It's obvious. Obviously, there are people, just as obvious, is that there are people on the other side of all of this. Why are there people, not why, we know why, because they're trying to steal, but let's talk about who is pushing to weaken American patent rights.
Well, the major player in this is Google. Yeah. And I'm a fan of Google. I've got the Pixel phone. I have a Pixel watch. Basically all of my kids have Google stuff.
Listen, to me, right, it's a tough choice, right, between Google phones and Apple phones, Android phones and Apple. And I have always, let me tell you why. I have always eschewed Apple ever since the iPod, the first iPods. You couldn't play MP3s, right? I couldn't take my CDs and burn them to MP3s or rip them to MP3s and play them on an iPod. And I said, something, forget it. I've already bought this media. I don't want to have to buy it again and again and again. And we could talk about whether or not that infringement's on IP. But the point is, so I said, forget it. A pox on you, Apple. And I've always gone down the other road. But now I'm stuck with Android, which of course we'll talk about.
So Google. I did the same thing. You could actually get into Android phones and give yourself Wi-Fi right from the beginning, which you couldn't do with Apple, which is why I went over to Android to start with as well. But in truth, Google's an ad company.
Yes.
So they make their money on ads and data. And so technology is how they get to deliver those ads and data. And so they just want cheaper technology. And it makes sense. If you're sitting in their corporate offices and you're looking at what are the costs of our businesses, intellectual property is a big one. So
Absolutely,
if you can
100%,
reduce that cost, it makes sense to them. But the problem is that patents are just a nerdy issue.
Right.
And so they can kind of get away with this on Capitol Hill. If it was
Yeah.
home builders that were coming up to Capitol Hill and saying, hey, lumber is expensive for us doing business. What we need is cheaper lumber. Capitol Hill would laugh at them.
Yes.
All right, they're politicians. They might not laugh,
Yeah.
but you know what I mean. They
Sure.
would send them away like, we
Yes.
can't give you cheaper lumber. That's
Sure,
going to hurt
yes.
the rest of the market.
Yeah.
But with patents, there's just more
Yeah.
court cases. There's more
Sure.
academics, and it's harder to explain.
No, and I appreciate this here. One of the things I found fascinating, and I know we're going to talk even more about the technology, was the issue of Square, and the issue of both Apple certainly, and I think Android to a somewhat lesser extent. Square had created this device, right? The thing you could plug into your headphone jack on your phone. Because the headphone jack was analog to digital, and they found a way to put it in there. And if you went analog, you would have to go. If you went analog, you didn't have to go through and get approved through their system. But if you plug it in through the USB port at the bottom, then you would have to go and get approved. I mean, obviously, it's their right. It's their right to do this. But this is kind of what we're talking about here. There's a certain degree of protection. You want to make sure that folks aren't abusing your patents and your rights there. But by the way, this is why we no longer have analog, 2.5 millimeter headphone jacks on most phones, and you have to get into. Am I right here?
I mean, I assume that that's a part of it.
Yeah.
I believe that they're saving real estate. I think that you get better data connections over the other.
Oh, maybe. Yeah.
But at the same time, I think all of those guys have now gone through the system and are in the app stores. I think one of the things you see is the permissionless innovation, which done, I think, when you push back against government, the way that Uber did.
Yeah.
I support that. But when you have it where you're pushing back against businesses, I think that there's something a little bit different, especially when you're doing it scale. Some small guys sometimes, might repackage a product to see if something will work for a little while. But when you're doing it at a large corporate scale, I'm not exactly sure how I feel about that, because that is running against other.
No, but
issues.
these are important. Like these are right. These are important questions to have the discussions about. Pulling it back to real property rights. When I say real, I don't mean the real as though they exist. I mean real estate, land property rights. Right. If you have someone has a cotton farm and a 100-acre cotton farm, and you've discovered a way to harvest that cotton much more efficiently than they did. You can't just go on their property and harvest it. You have to get their permission in order to go down this road. This is essentially what we're talking about here. You have to. These property rights are intellectual property rights are property rights that are in existence. I was going to say real property rights, but they're different in that regard. Let's sort of turn our attention to. I mean, did we really? I don't think we even got to the question about who's trying to weaken these things.
So it's a lot of the large tech companies.
Got it. Oh, Google
are trying it. We have Google, we have Apple. Those are kind of the big ones.
It's interesting because the other thing, and I can be as guilty as anybody else because I want stuff and I want now, and there are things that I like. That I like not having to pay for them. Like I said, taking the media that I own and converting it, so I can watch movies on my computer, from DVDs that I bought or music that I've listened to. There was another, Google Books was a prime example of this, right? Google had taken and digitized a bunch of books, but they can't just do that, right? You can't take and sort of make I don't know. There are books that I loved when I was a kid that are hard to find in print nowadays. You can't just do that and sort of take these because the author of the book, there's patent and there's copyright, and this is a violation of the copyright side of things.
Yeah, the copyright law. I will say, in intellectual property, copyright law is the one that still confounds me. I love intellectual property, and I believe that people should be able to get a copyright.
Yeah.
I'm still unsure about the amount of years people can keep copyrights for. I'm open to hearing the debates about it, though, because again, I support the nice thing about a patent. When a drug company comes up with a new drug, they get that patent for 20 years.
Yeah.
Now, there's conversations that could even be longer or should be longer because it actually takes sometimes 10, 11 years
Sure.
to get it to market. So they only have 10 years to make their money back. And so that's one of the reasons we see higher
Sure.
drug prices. So maybe they should have 20 years after the government approves it. I don't know. I'm not
Maybe.
going to make that case, but at the same time, that's interesting to me. But the nice thing about a patent
Yeah.
is that it discloses innovation so that others can eventually use it. There's
Right.
a Congressman Thomas Massey. He's an
Yep.
MIT grad. His claim to fame is actually some 3D software, and
Okay.
he made it so that you could, I believe, model things.
You say it's just that's his claim to fame. I think his claim to fame is just being a really cool congressman. But go ahead.
He's also
So, yes,
he's also the greenest
Yes.
Congress member.
Okay.
He lives off the grid at his house. Has a
until somebody discovers that he's living off the grid, and then they'll make sure to shut him. I'm sorry. He's invented the 3D software though.
So, but
Yeah.
he invented 3D software that helped people model things in 3D. It ended up making money as doctors started using it. They could do operations or learn how to do operations with the feedback that he designed into the system. But now those copyrights or those trademarks,
Yeah. Patents. Yes. I'm sorry. I've
intellectual
confused you.
property. That intellectual property is coming off of patent, and so now we're going to see 3D modeling become easier in the
Sure.
marketplace. We've seen 3D printers proliferate in the
Yep.
marketplace recently because the first 3D printer patents started going away. But the only reason we're here today, or we're at this point in the market, is that those first people came and were able to prove the market and refine on the product and actually let people see what this could do. And so we needed them to have the incentives to get it out there. We need pharma
Yeah.
to have the incentives to develop new drugs, and we need inventors like your daughter to come up with new ways to make our lives easier.
It really isn't. And when we talk about pharma, there's a balance that has to be reached, right? There's a balance that has to be reached between the period of exclusivity and the ability of others to innovate on those things. I mean, that's how we do it. But you cannot have innovation without some kind of reliance on a period of exclusivity.
Yeah, they're spending
Yeah.
$2 billion to come out with a
Yeah.
new drug.
Yes.
If you tell me spend $2 billion to come up with an idea and then somebody else can steal it and you can't do anything about it,
Right. Well,
I'm
there
not
goes the
going to
incentive.
spend the $2 billion. I'm going to put it in the bank and then I'm going to go live on my luxury yacht
Sure.
while everything else burns down.
Yeah, or I'm gonna go someplace and steal it. So let's talk about the situations when there is infringement, right? Why is it so hard to prove infringement?
Well, one of the things is that if we look at kind of every other area of government, let's say
And
somebody.
then let me add to this:
Yeah.
why is it so hard to get injunctions once infringement is proved? But I'm sorry, go ahead. It's a two-step process. yeah.
Injunctions have gone off the rails.
Yeah.
But when somebody comes onto your property, if somebody's in your house
Yes.
at night, you call the police, right?
Yes.
And hopefully they show up in time. And they
Especially now that you're not allowed to defend yourself in many places. But go ahead.
And they take the guy out of the house and lock him up, and you're good.
Yes.
Well, Josh Malone walks into a store and sees somebody selling his exact product.
Yes.
There's no police to call.
Right.
There's nobody to call. What does he have to do? He has to take them to court.
Yes.
And this is one of those interesting things with conservatives because we push back against a lot of trial attorneys
Sure,
and
yeah,
everything
absolutely,
through the
yeah.
years. But the only way to enforce a patent is by taking somebody to court.
Sure.
So at first you send kind of a stern letter, like,
Yeah.
please stop making this. And then you're like, and then it's a demand letter. Stop making this. Or
I
I'm
am
taking you
thinking
to
about
court.
the Winklevosses and Mark Zuckerberg. Go ahead.
And so it's stop making this or I'm
Yes.
taking you to court. And then eventually it's court. And
Yeah.
so Josh Malone's case took years and millions of dollars. And at some point, the U.S. government even filed against him.
Wow.
In the court case.
I don't
And-
think I remember that. Why did the U.S. government have a position in this?
Well, because they were a party in the patent. And
I
so
see.
the people that infringed asked them to say that it wasn't a good patent. And then under the Trump administration, Andrei Yanku was the director of the USPTO, and he ended up pulling the amicus brief.
Okay.
And I don't know that that's what let the case finally
Sure.
be settled, but that was one of the big final steps is when the U.S. government finally backed out of the case.
Listen, these are important things. It's important for people to get involved in that. So what's next? I mean, what are we looking at in terms of obviously there's not much that can get done with a divided Congress, but what's going on in the executive branch on this? What's going on in both houses of Congress moving forward?
Actually, in some ways, the problem with patents, or the good thing about patents, is that they're fairly bipartisan. There's bipartisan opposition and there's bipartisan support. So we just got through a fight where it was the Pride and Patent Ownership Act.
Okay.
You know me, I've never supported a bill, but I have wanted to, or a regulation, but I have wanted to support of a bill that would let the opposition of the bill submit an alternate name for the bill.
Sure.
Because this would really be the force inventors to expose themselves before they're ready act. So the Pride and Patent Ownership Bill, it's kind of like the Pride and Gun Ownership Bill, where register all of your guns today. Sure. If you really support guns, you're going to march down.
Absolutely, yes. I get it. I love it. I love the idea. I love what you're saying.
The other issue that both you and I have dealt with is the Pride and Donation Act.
Sure, of
course. It would be a similar idea. And it's just, look, you
appeal to your sense of patriotism, yes.
You have a right to donate to somebody without disclosing it. You have a right to own a gun without disclosing it. And with a patent, what you do is your name is on the patent. Your name is always going to be on the patent. But if you sell it to somebody, or if you have a licensing agreement with somebody, they might not be on the patent. And so what happens is somebody like, I've already thrown Google under the bus, so we'll continue with Google. If Google sees that Charlie Sauer invented something, then they can say, oh, I can take on Charlie.
Sure.
And they're like, oh, he just started working with this firm who's likely to come after us. Let's go after Charlie now.
Yeah.
So that we can take out his patent before they get anywhere. And so this is the problem. There's it's just really hard to defend your patent.
Sure.
And when they make you disclose everything, and this one has other problems. There's 10 sections to the bill. In the bill, they also say that if you get something wrong when you're disclosing agreements, let's say you and I have an agreement, and then later on down the road, you end up selling it to somebody, but we wrote it down wrong, then the patent's invalid.
Wow.
So there's all sorts of issues with the bill, but fortunately we got it pulled. But that's what we're dealing with. Every month there's a new issue on patents. We saw it with the vaccine. President Biden was trying to let other countries have the rights to push the vaccines. Some of the international organizations were saying that it wasn't right that other people had the rights to manufacture vaccines.
No, and it's funny because I sort of come down in a weird way on this, because I think the U.S. government, first of all, listen, we probably don't want to go down the road of sort of getting into whether or not the patents are valid because the vaccines don't do what we all thought that they did, or anyway, there was an overpromise and, shall we say, an underdelivery on that. Anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry, I sort of derailed it for a second.
No.
But the reality is, if you spend the money on developing this thing, you have rights in this, unless you've ceded those rights away for whatever reason. But go ahead.
Well, and so we have these attacks. Pride and Patent Ownership Bill, again, just one of them. There's currently a kangaroo court, the Patent Trial and Appeals Board.
Okay.
That is at the patent office. So it's a kangaroo court because there's no actual judges. So it was created, the Republicans created it under the Obama administration. But it was. So
there's no judges.
So there's no judges, but there's this panel that sits. I mean, they're not. I guess they're considered judges, but they aren't judges. But so there's a case to explain how bad the PTAB is. The PTAB kills 80% of the patents that come before it.
That's insane.
And but there was one case. It was under the Obama administration, and Michelle Lee was the director. She's a former Google exec. She was the director of the USPTO at the time. And the inventor won the case.
Okay.
Won in front of PTAB, and PTAB ruled in his favor. Michelle Lee said, no, hear it again and put another person on the panel. And they heard the case again.
Yeah.
And the panel again ruled in favor of the inventor. And Michelle Lee said, but wait, there's more, and put another person on the panel. And I actually think that one was her, but I forget the exact case. And at that point, they then ruled against the inventor and took the patent away from the
This
inventor.
seems, I mean, anyway, of course, it's founded in statute, obviously, and so it's signed into law, but there seems, again, this is why people have to pay attention, isn't it?
Oh, it's
So what's happening in Congress?
not only do you have to pay attention, but honestly, you have to pay attention. It's not necessarily that things happen in the dark, smoke-filled back rooms.
Yeah.
It's that it happens in this nerdy language that's hard to track.
Perfect. This is a good segue here, Charlie.
Yeah.
Because, sorry, go ahead. You were about to finish up.
It's the
Yeah.
nerdy language that's hard to track. And so you have to pay attention to that. You have to pay attention to what we put out as the Market Institute.
Speaking of nerdy language, because I want to talk about it, we love sort of peeling back what folks do when they're not doing the policy work or political work that they're doing. This is related to it. You got a new podcast. Pardon, what is it? Pardon my parsing, which I love. Yes.
Pardon my parsing.
Yes.
So we look at political speeches.
Yeah.
And we go through the political speeches, and we all know that there's a lot of fluff in political
Yes.
speeches. So if President Biden delivers an hour-long speech, once you get it pared back, it's really more like a 15-minute speech.
Of course.
And so,
And not just because of his idiosyncratic way of talking.
no, it's actually a fun thing. You compare a Biden speech to a Trump speech. An hour-long Trump speech is more like 5 minutes.
Oh my God.
But it's fun to compare a Hillary Clinton hour-long speech is actually still like 55 minutes.
Sure.
Which is also an oh my God moment. And so it's fun to compare these people, but it also makes talking about the speeches more interesting because you're pulling it back to what is it that this person is actually saying. We were talking about it before, but I learned that, President Carter was actually somebody that I'm a fan of. I believe he might be a new libertarian hero. I'm still trying to prove that. He still has some problems.
Yes.
But the truth is he did more deregulation than any Republican, I think, in the past.
So, and you're doing this with a former professor of yours, not someone who was involved in politics, but someone who ran your college radio station. You didn't do college radio too, did you?
I didn't do college radio. Okay. And I did take his public speaking class at one point. But, it was an easy A, as he says. All you had to do was show up and get up and speak every once in a while, and you would get it. But he's somebody who he cares about politics, but he doesn't live on Capitol Hill. He hasn't walked the halls of Congress in worn out shoe leather. And so it's fun to get that outside of DC, that outside of the bubble kind of input. And I think it really makes the show what it is.
That's good. So you played baseball and then softball. You're not still playing. Are you still playing softball at all?
Nope. I'm out. I'm now a father of 3 daughters, so I'm now at the ballet studio with them.
So with that in mind, you have your kids, you're doing your policy work. Any other kind of outside interests, the stuff that what gets you jazzed? You're on. It's a Saturday. You're not at the ballet studio with the kids. What's Charlie Sauer doing?
I'm usually inventing something.
Are you really?
I love coming up with kind of the dumb inventions or possibly the next new thing. It's fun to sit and think, and it's fun to think and build and try to figure out how to make an idea come to life.
Do you have a workshop?
I mean, I have a workshop. I mean, I've got a welder. I have 3 3D printers. I've got whatever you want. You come over, we can make it.
I am incredibly envious of this because my brother is the I've got 2 brothers. One of whom is really great at home repair and stuff around the house. Yeah. The other one is making furniture and doing stuff. He's really passionate about replicating football helmets, making replica football helmets. Again, it sounds like I'm poo-pooing. I'm really not. So, but the idea of having that sort of workshop space and building these things, I see the videos on YouTube. The guy who invents the fake package that. Have you ever seen these?
That's Mark Rober.
Yeah.
He's one of my internet heroes. Actually, the favorite video that I ever made was based off of a Mark Rober idea. But I showed that regulation makes things slower to come to market. I built a giant Plinko board, which is Mark Rober style, but it was 4 foot by 6 foot.
Nice.
And showed that as there was more regulations, it took a ball longer to get to the bottom.
Wait a minute. Have you done this as a YouTube video?
Yeah, it's up.
All right. I gotta go find that. I will make sure I tweet that out. Charlie Sauer, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on.
And thank you all for joining us for another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire podcast. I'm Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.